Hello and welcome to Mastering Change. This podcast is all about creating a space to talk openly and honestly about trauma and mental health. Whether it's through expert insights or personal stories, we're here to learn and grow with you.
Today, we're joined by Knibbs. She's a human behaviour technologist, cybertrauma author, and epigenetic trauma psychotherapist. And today, we're diving into something that's been a big conversation of late, the impact of technology on mental health.
Kath explains something we don't often think about, cybertrauma. It's the trauma that happens through our screens. And she takes us through how digital environments affect our emotions and psychological health. It's something we're all navigating, but never really talk about.
It's an issue that's growing and we can all sense and experience it around us. And Kath brings some powerful insights into how things like online abuse, especially technology-facilitated sexual abuse, are creating lasting and invisible scars.
She talks about how our nervous system reacts the same way to virtual threats as it does to real-world threats. And it's such an important point because so many of us spend so much of our time online without realising how it might be affecting us on a deeper level.
It's a fascinating conversation and I think it's going to challenge a lot of ways we think about relationships with technology. So let's get into it. Knibbs, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our podcast.
We start every podcast with a little bit of an icebreaker, which is a card game created by Esther Perel. The idea behind which is to help facilitate kind of storytelling. Stories are bridges to connection. So I'm going to pick one from the top and we can go from there.
Okay.
And the card I've just pulled out is I lie to my therapist about ...
Everything. When I started, and the reason I say that is because when I began my training a number of years ago, I was asked to go to therapy and probably like everybody else in the profession turned up and went, don't even know what I'm here for. There's nothing wrong. So I effectively lied from the outset until it became a space where I felt there was enough of a trusting relationship, you know, the things that we all need to actually provide for our clients.
Could you tell me, I mean, cyber trauma was something that you wanted to talk about, and it's a term I have heard before. So I think I'd like you to start by explaining what cyber trauma is first off.
Okay. I will keep it very succinct because I have a very long academic definition of what this is, but I will summarize it really that it is any trauma that occurs through or via an internet-ready device, and that can be instigated or facilitated by an human being, or it can now include artificial intelligence driven models. I've been developing this concept since around 2011, and the distinction between where we sit now in terms of theory and our thinking around this is the kinds of traumas that occur online are now permanent, can be revisited, can affect us more than once, can be completely delayed into the future. And it's a kind of trauma that I'm really suggesting is not like any other that we have talked about previously because of this persistence to being permanent in the form of data in terms of ones and zeros. It might be that you are affected by something now. So somebody might send you an image or a message, and we'll probably talk about the kinds of traumas that I see in this space. But if somebody sent you something now, there is the possibility that that event can be revisited. So rather than it being a stored memory that you might talk to your therapist about, you can actually take in the evidence and you can keep revisiting that particular issue time and time and time again with additional comments and reflections from other people, and the fact it can then be reshared and it can be downloaded. And in the world of data and how we understand this permanence, if it can be downloaded, that means it can be re-uploaded. And that means there's a significant change in the way we now think about the reoccurrence of a potential event and how that event can then reoccur in the future many, many, many times over.
As you were talking, I mean, because I was trying to think about how this differs from traditional trauma. And instead of thinking about how it differs from traditional trauma, I was actually drawing parallels to how it kind of relates to, I don't know if this is even right, but I was just thinking about someone who, for example, who is every time they get into a relationship, they always go back to an abusive partner. So it's this kind of chronic abuse cycle. I guess it's almost like that happens immediately as soon as cyber trauma starts.
Yeah. And one of my so I really began to understand this in around 2011. So my background is in and around technology, and the way I understood this was something that happened to me, quite personal, in terms of my rubber banding back into my childhood, which was when Facebook began in 2007. I did what everybody else did. I added colleagues, I added friends, I went and added people I knew from Friends Reunited, and I created this new emerging space of people who I can be in contact with, because that's what the internet offered at the time. And in adding school friends, somebody shared a picture. Here we all are in our last year of school. And, for anybody who doesn't know this at all about me, I have very, very curly hair. And I was also still at the stage of developing. I was wearing mouth braces, and I didn't have a very great time at school. And what happened was, the moment that image got shared, I was rubber banded back into a time that I'd long, long forgotten in that moment. And I really sat there going, okay, I wasn't ready for that. That really took me back to a time and a place through something I didn't have, which was a copy of this particular photograph. And at the time, you could be tagged. And when you were tagged, it then meant your friends could see. And there was all this exponential panic. There was all this exponential, I can't control this, happening in the moment. Now, this was only taking, days at a time for people to be added, to tag you into a photograph, and for all of those memories to come flooding back, but in a way that it was very different to when I was talking to my therapist about, I'm recalling an event and it's my memory doing so in this moment. This was now physically in front of me, and the perception of me and myself in that moment became all, kind of unraveled, all in the space of moments. And in around 2012, 2013, I started to work with some children. And at the time, I was still doing relationships and sex education teaching. And my own children were exposed to some material that would be rated 18 and is completely illegal. And it wasn't pornography. And I had to kind of really take a moment and say, wow, that's very different to going and watching a horror movie that's made up. This was a particularly distressing piece of material that circulates then, and it still circulates to this day. And they saw this piece of material and content, and we talked about it. And I really started to think, okay, what does this do to a person when they're exposed to this kind of material? And then at the end of 2012, 2013, so this is how long I've been doing this particular issue. I worked with an 8-year-old boy who had been exposed to child sexual abuse material online and was being asked to produce his own material for the perpetrators. And if I think about where he is now in the world, he's in his 20s. And that material still exists. It still circulates online if it's not kind of identified in a particular way. And my thinking at the time was, and what happens when that image reemerges? What happens if he realizes at the age of, 25, 26, he gets married, and the evocative stage of having children reemerges that trauma for him, and he's now looking at his real world child and thinking about his internet version of what he was doing. and how that would affect him. So I really started to do a lot of meta thinking. And I know that that makes this particular type of trauma sound really, really scary and overwhelming. And for a lot of us to think about this permanence and reoccurrence, it's really mind-boggling at times, because none of us actually know where we're going with technology at the moment, which makes it even more complicated.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of things that were coming to me. Minta was looking for the similarities, and what I was seeing is the vast difference in the way that you experience the trauma in cyber context. It's very individualistic. It's very closed, like I mean, that I guess they are also similarities, but the way that you experience the trauma, often in the real world, there is like an experience that sits around, whereas you can be traumatized in a very safe physical environment, but by the consumption, whatever's happening through the screen can really undermine that sense of safety and physicality in the physical. And I was just thinking that sort of does change the games in how we understand, a person's experience of trauma, because you can be, feel physically safe, but psychologically unsafe because of what you're kind of consuming. And I'm also, just to kind of put 2 points together, is, I'm in the middle of Jonathan Haid's Anxious Generation. And, what strikes me a lot is this idea that, he in him saying that we're too safe in the real world and wildly too unsafe in the digital world. And, and what that kind of makes you think is just pull your children back. But the reality of the world in which we're living in is just not an approach, that is feasible. So I guess those two things were occurring to me. The different environment, if you like, for the experiencing of the trauma, and the fact that you said it is you can't reject technology in pursuit of safety.
Yes, absolutely. And there is another layer. So at the moment, I've moved into a space of talking about a cyber biopsychosocial model, which is that involvement of us and our psyches in the space of what I call cyber synapses. Because also the part that we understand in terms of trauma theory, if we go with Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory, is the bit that I and I love sharing this little bit of information, is when we use our devices. Now, I've moved back because of the camera and the slight hitch that we had earlier, but you will find if you hold your device and you sit near your computer, you are approximately 30 to 40 centimeters from that screen. And that distance is intimate, and your body knows that intimate distance. And neurobiologically, you are told by your nervous system and the threat detection, the neuroception, you are safe. And this is why, in the moment when something occurs, it can have such a stress or shock factor, because neurobiologically, you are not aware of any of the preceding or precipitating factors and signals that your body would detect as you would in the corporeal world. So it adds on a layer of unexpected. I think so. Stephen Porges talks about neural expectations. There's a lack of neural expectation, and so for many of us, and for the people that I work with in the space of the removal of child sexual abuse material, the analysts are being affected in ways that really I'm still trying to develop trainings and theory, and to try and help people understand exactly why some of this type of trauma is very different to all of the kinds of trauma that we've dealt with before. And, however, this follows. If we know how to work with trauma in the corporeal world, we can work with it when it's an online medium, but also we need that level of cognitive understanding about the permanence and the reoccurrence and the impact that will have on a person in terms of that the way that they now perceive the world, particularly for those people who have been sexually abused or sexually assaulted, especially as we now move into the immersive environments, which is what I'm already dealing with as a clinician.
In the corporeal context, we've got lots of kind of modalities, approaches, techniques, that's around somatic practice, boundaries. There's so much that exists in our understanding. We show up in that way. But, that insight around the closeness of your screen and the triggers of intimacy and safety that incites brain, actually, there is some pathways towards some practical implementable approaches.
I disagree. I think that there aren't practical approaches that you can tell someone who works like an analyst who's working with sexual abuse images, for example, because we are evolved to have a system that recognizes when we're in danger, right? Recognizes. So if suddenly if I'm walking down a dark street in a city like London, for example, and I am ready to sense the danger that's around me. My nervous system is in fight or flight immediately already. But I'm sitting on my computer at work in my nice safe house where I feel safe. My body is rest and digest. If we're going to talk about Stephen Porges thing. So I am not ready, and there is nothing that we would be able to do, or one would be able to do, to say prime yourself for danger now. You're working in an environment that suddenly you're going to be seeing really traumatic images.
So there has been a lot of research and development in this particular space, and there are certain protocols that are used within those environments to minimize that level. Obviously, we can't eradicate it, but there is also certainly within policing and law enforcement and working as the analysts, there are certain things that they can and that they do within those environments in order to manage what's happening at the moment. And we will get to a stage where we can, facilitate the use of AI to help us do that. But even in those circumstances, what the analysts have to, and I'm going to be very careful because it's really traumatic to talk about and it's really traumatic to hear about. And certainly these analysts have to do a really, really difficult job. It's the content moderation that happens behind the scenes of all of us using our devices, and really working in that environment. What I've been able to do is take in that trauma-informed lens and help them understand the how and the why, exactly what you've said there. No matter what we do, we cannot eradicate neuroception. We cannot eradicate what our nervous systems will do to try and protect us, because that's what it is to be human.
You mentioned kind of sexual abuse online, and I think that was, is that what you did your PhD in?
My PhD thesis is in around children viewing inappropriate material. Let's call it inappropriate material, which does not include sexual material, and really, that's because I have the two kind of spokes as the work that I do. One is around all of the issues around sexual material. So that can be the viewing of pornography by primary school age children, secondary school age children, and then working with what's known as TASCA or OESC. There's so many acronyms within this space that it becomes confusing in itself. But also the other side of this is thinking about what happens to us when we see graphic and violent imagery. And that's really where this began in the very first instance in terms of what my children were exposed to. So I have the kind of two lenses. One is in the space of sexual violence and sexual abuse, and the other one is around graphic imagery, gore, and that kind of stuff.
What does happen to us physiologically and ongoing?
And is there a difference between those two types?
In the work that I do with the children, I would say that in their presentations, it looks very, very similar to PTS. It looks very similar to the kinds of trauma responses you would expect a human to have. Children are reporting when they see this violent and graphic material that it affects them in the same ways that it would do if they were to see a horror movie or if they were to see something violent in the streets. They have the same kind of vicarious trauma impacts. And the way the children have described it is absolutely gorgeous in terms of polyvagal theory. They've talked about their tummies, they've talked about their heads, they've talked about certain feelings that they get. and the kinds of cognitive thoughts that sit alongside it. And the sexual abuse trauma tends to be about this perception of intrusion, but the intrusion is not like a physical intrusion, and yet the children are still talking in the same way that a real world sexual abuse victim would. And it's highly contested at the moment about whether an immersive environment sexual assault is the same as the real world. But in terms of our reactions as a human being, yes, it's very, very similar. It's very much the same.
So it's in these kind of video games, when you're talking about an immersive sexual trauma, it would be, just so that I understand, it's like if you are playing a video game and you're a character, let's just say and you're in a space, in an environment, and another character comes in this video game and abuses you, or yeah, is that?
It can be where you immerse yourself into the character. So this is the difficulty with the language we have at the moment. It's the nomenclature just isn't broad enough, or it's kind of brought down to words like a parasocial relationship. So we talk about the kinds of relationships we have with our avatars and how we might create them and invest in them, and then we perceive ourselves as part of the avatar. And the presentation of the avatar is a representation of ourself. And so if it's a video game character, and I'm going to say on a 2D screen, that gets assaulted, yes, the perception is I was violated, because that's how the young people will speak. However, I'm also talking about the virtual reality immersive environments in which the way that your eyes work in that environment, you are in that game, you become part of that game. So you are the avatar. And in that moment, you have the same kind of 360-degree viewpoint. You have the same sense of somebody being close to you because you can hear their breathing. And in those instances, it can feel just as similar. And it's very, very difficult for people to describe it. And they will say it was the same as if. And the distinction is, how does the brain know, when we know from neuroscience that what your eyes perceive, especially if you're in a VR environment, is no different to what you see in the real world once you've got a VR headset on and all of the outside cues are taken away by the very fact that you have this particular headset on.
And it's really interesting because you'd think you would just pull the headset off and be able to, like...
Yeah, sadly, that's not the case. People freeze, people try and walk backwards physically in the real world when that doesn't actually have an impact on what's happening in the virtual reality space. And certainly the same sensations are miscued. And what I mean by that is... So I'll give an example. So I get very excited by technology. I use technology in therapy. I like technology. And when the first VR headset came out, I put it on. I was playing a game where you were going down a hill. And as the little skateboard thing went up a little ramp, very similar to a humpback bridge, my body and stomach did the, but there's no gravity to pull your stomach back down. And in that very moment, I went, holy moly. My body and brain absolutely understood this particular viewpoint, and it behaved as it would in the real world, but there wasn't the physical sensation of gravity to give me the sensation of my tummy going back down.
It's fascinating. And you're saying that video game scenario and the kind of VR scenario plays out in both ends of that spectrum of the non-sex graphic violent material and the sex material. It has the same consequence in experience.
How we would measure that, I don't know, but the language that the clients use is the same. And that's what and this is why I'm so fascinated with this topic, because I'm trying to understand it on a neurobiological level. I'm trying to understand it on a kind of metaphysical, who am I? What do I represent? How am I represented in this space? And also, from the lens of trauma, well, what words do we use? When somebody says to me, I felt like I was, and often people will talk about being virtually raped. but they will say that it was this. And those are the words we have for the real world physical events and experiences. And that's what we have in the legal terminology, but we don't yet have this nuanced language to actually give us the distinctions between what is this and what is that.
Is it illegal? Is it legal? Is it what can people be taken to court?
So yeah, there are cases that have been taken to court. A lot of this happens in America first at the moment. Sadly, we are a little bit behind in how we're perceiving the whole technological space at the moment. But yes, virtual sexual assault, that's the legal term that's being used at the moment, is the same in terms of the violation of another person's personal space, and therefore the corporeal legal framework is being used for the virtual legal framework. But there are things that we do not have laws around at the moment because we do not have the understanding, and we certainly do not have the long-term research around it.
I think this is the language, if I think about the psychiatrists and the psychotherapists, they're going to come at this from the reverse place. They're going to come at the presentations and try and make sense of it through the experiences. I mean, how do you best work backwards then?
Sometimes it's a moment of me engaging in a process, whether that be gaming or in the VR environment, for me to suddenly go, oh, I get it. Because, and one of these examples is all the way back actually in 13, 14. One of the children I was working with was talking about being cyberbullied, and she talked about, and they talk about me on Twitter as it was then, and she was representing things in the sand tray, and she'd popped her figure in, and she said, I don't know where to put this other one. And we were talking about the sand tray and the fact it had boundaries, and she said, I'd have to go to the end of the corridor, Kath, and even then it wouldn't be the right place because this stuff will always be there and the impact will always be visible. Therefore, I need this figure to be somewhere that's beyond the physicality of the room and beyond the physicality of the corridor. She wasn't using the word physicality. But I sat there and I went, wow, you're talking about infinity. That's really what you're talking about. And it's moments like that that really help me understand how people perceive that the way that the young person explained it is, you might think that being bullied is something that happens and then you leave school, but actually my bullying is online and everybody and anybody can see it. And it wasn't a grandiose reflection. It's the truth. Because as long as that data exists, and it will do somewhere, even if Twitter closes down, that data will still be somewhere. There is the potential for it to re-emerge somewhere in the future.
Well, and I think that was the permanency that you were alluding to at the start of the conversation. When you saw your image. I had a very similar moment. I was a child, and so actually that I rejected social media for a long time because I thought there's a lot of people actually don't want to connect back to, and memories and experiences that I don't want to celebrate. But I think I was at the age, being the age that I was when social media had its kind of moment, had that level of maturity to know when to kind of reject going there. But it is a similar, I think it's that idea that the we can work through past memories and experiences through all of these brilliant modalities that the people in our field have been championing and recognizing. But there is something in the underlying permanency of the visual representation of that space that is like that kind of re-traumatizing.
Yeah.
And because it's such a specific trauma, what kind of tools or strategies have you found? Like Emma talks about all of these modalities that work in the, for other traumas. And you just mentioned the sandbox just there, which is obviously a modality in itself. And I was wondering, what have you found to be most effective working with survivors of technologically facilitated trauma or cyber trauma?
Many of the metaphors of technology help me work with clients. So, for example, using the metaphor of being able to move forwards and backwards on this is going to show my age, a VHS tape machine, where you can go forward and you can skip back. Actually, one of the things that you can do with technology is you can learn to do things like muting people, blocking people, banning people. There's lots of options. And it's really taken from a model that's called gamification. And what I tend to do with my clients is we talk about, okay, if you had a different ending, what would you do? If the technology existed and it could help you remove this, how would you do that? Now, there is really only one domain in which you can have any of your issue like this removed, and that would be around sexual material. For everything else, it is online. And if it's, as I talked about in one of my early books, the little girl who had her photographs, so they were photoshopped, we talked about, well, what could you do about that? And there is a process very similar to acceptance and commitment there, where you really begin to understand that, okay, that picture is going to exist on Facebook for forevermore until that person takes it down. And what are the options in today's world about being able to do that? Well, you could write them a letter, you could email them, you could ask for it being taken down, you could report it. And it's really having a conversation about the options that we have and the options that we don't have. And the fact that this particular thing, whatever it is, whatever the event was, may always exist. And that's very similar to the kind of corporeal stuff that we do, in terms of we cannot go back and prevent that incident from happening. We cannot go back and change the domestic abuse that you encountered, but we can go back and tell a different story, and we can go back and change the ending, and we can think about what we do going forward. So sometimes it's through the use of technology that maybe with the children, we go and build the Minecraft village in which they were successful and they didn't have this story, and they get to do with it what they want. So sometimes the technology actually provides the space in which you can do things that you cannot do in the real world. And the imagination and the fantasy and the good endings are possible. And really, I would say the skill of a good trauma therapist is being able to do that anyway. And certainly with the technology, I've got so many other tools at my disposal. So whether it's a sand tray or a virtual sand tray, or whether it's painting, or the equivalent where we might go and draw something and paint it on the iPad, or where we might build it in Fortnite or Roblox or Minecraft or one of the other games that exists.
It's interesting, I know that talking about technology, just in trauma treatment, you said a good trauma therapist will be able to help someone reimagine. It's about reimagining a different ending, reimagining a new future. Whereas if you've been stuck in your trauma, you've been stuck in that never-ending cycle of shame or whatever it is that's causing you, that's showing up in your body and in your life, you need to be able to reimagine a life where you are unstuck, where that's no longer happening, and using technology to kind of create that world for you in which thing didn't happen, perhaps, like you say, where you create a new Minecraft space where you were successful. I think that's a really kind of almost ingenious way of reimagining a life without the trauma.
Because it also puts technology in its rightful place as a tool to humanity, as opposed to a weapon against humanity. And I think that different, well, it's not, that seismic difference is really important. I mean, I went to a fascinating immersive day on AI, which was all about commerce, really. But I just found that, like, the hope is as big as the fear, but it's a natural human inclination to lean into the fear. And so I kind of like the reclaiming it as a tool as opposed to a weapon. And I would certainly say one of my premises around where we are at the moment in terms of the Chicken Little in the, oh my gosh, everything's so bad, we should ban it, bury it, throw it away. Actually, technology is a tool and a medium.
And we often forget, for example, that social media is the medium through which we socialize. What we tend to do is talk about it as though it's a tool. And when you talk about it in that way, then it becomes a tool that can be used for good and bad. We do tend to focus on the bad, in air quotes, she says. And this is currently where we are at the moment. So in the space at this point in time, I am not anti-tech because I use biofeedback, I use gaming, I use VR spaces, because what you can do in those VR environments is create the monster with which you defeat. And that is immense, to see the change in somebody's somatic presentation, to see the way that they now feel victorious over their enemy. And the enemy is not the person in the game. Obviously, we're talking about the monster in the fantasy, or the monster in the abuse, or the monster in the trauma. And I have certainly found that it is such a cathartic way to do some of the trauma resolution. And on the outside, it absolutely looks like I'm playing on the Xbox with the children, or I'm playing on the VR equipment. And really, what we're doing is navigating their journey in a different way.
We have a lot of conversations in this field because I come from a marketing consultancy background, not from this field, but many moons ago. And just that narrative around, in this space, people see marketing as a weapon that's being used by children in our societies.
Yeah.
But I argue the case every time that it can be used for negative impact, but it is a tool. It's just like a hammer. I can pick it up and I can harm someone, or I can pick it up, I can be really constructive. And I think the same is important around technology and artificial intelligence. And that's, I love how you've integrated, tech into the concept of healing from cyber trauma, or healing pathways through cyber trauma, with the actual technology. It was the medium that facilitated it. I think it's, really interesting.
It's like much better than exposure, but like I completely disagree with exposure therapy around trauma. But it's like using the thing that created the trauma to heal the trauma.
And the dichotomy is, if the technology is used to create the trauma, so quite often in domestic abuse situations, the technology facilitates the abuse in a very silent and subtle way. Or if it's used for kind of the child sexual abuse material, actually, these people, our clients, do not have an option in today's world to avoid technology. So I perceive, certainly my role is to help them be in that space where the trauma occurred, in the same way that we might talk about a person who was mugged on a particular street, that we wouldn't necessarily tell them to go back down the street, but actually they can't avoid streets for the rest of their life. Technology is absolutely necessary to a child's education. It's absolutely necessary for a business to run. And so the dichotomy is, it occurred on this thing, but this thing is the thing that is necessary for me to survive. And quite often that's where the stuckness occurs.
Abstinence is not a possibility from tech in modern living.
No.
Have to find a way to integrate it constructively and positively so people can get comfortable with what modern life is and looks like.
Yeah.
What I'm really fascinated in is what you're working on. So you talked about a model, like, are you doing some research? Where is your work focused, and what are you trying to kind of prove or educate?
I'm currently on my 7th book to help parents understand the space. The work that I've done is kind of, it really evolves helping. So I'm helping an organisation that works with CSAM material understand why a trauma-informed approach to having they're called hotlines, having a hotline that's trauma-informed from the bottom up, top down, why that would really change the way in which we deal with the victims, the ones who have to be identified, the ones whose material that everybody's looking at, the staff who have to work in that environment. So I'm working in that domain at the moment with a large set of Eastern European countries. I am training some therapists coming up on how to use technology in therapy for working with all forms of trauma, the kinds of things that we can do with adults, the things that we can use with children. And really the ongoing training around understanding cyber trauma for professionals who work with this, because so often when an event happens, people will downplay it and dismiss it. Well, it was only online, or it was only this, or just shut it off or turn it off. And one of the things I would certainly say is it's really helping people understand it's not just a game. It's not just a social media post. And really understanding that, for example, if you were coerced into producing an image as a child, which is then used by perpetrators of crimes against children, that yes, you may spend the rest of your life thinking, who's seen that image? You might be concerned about what happens when you begin in employment, but there's also the ever looming threat that if that image is identified, that you will be notified that it's been identified, because that's the legal system at this point in time. It's my hope, actually, in conversations like this, that we really understand that it's not necessarily just a now, in terms of, as clients will say, but it's not just now, Kath. It's in the future, and knowing something can come back, or knowing something has the threat to that puts us into that forever what if anxiety state.
Yeah, spike,
which
really spike. There you go.
Yeah, and that has merit. It has absolute merit and truth. Whereas many years ago, we would have said, "Oh well, it's not really a problem, is it? If something happened." Well, actually, it is really a problem for a lot of these children. So we need to, as a society, create a space where we actually have a relationship in which they can come and tell us what they're seeing, where they're going, who they're interacting it with, without that threat of, we're going to take it away.
Judgment and judgment. And I think what you're describing also is that kind of inherent shame, because if something like that situation's happened and you're waiting for that future that gets discovered, that's going to affect people's ability to build meaningful relationships with themselves, with a significant other, with their family, because they hold people away in fear of them uncovering this reality. Yeah, it's really the dynamics that sit around it are super.
Yeah, and I've often said, we talk about ACEs, we haven't talked about cyber ACEs. We've talked about trauma for a very long time, but in the trauma space, we haven't really talked about the 27-year-olds and under who have been exposed to this, and the first generation of internet users. My children are first generation internet users. They did go through this. They did share their images. They did encounter some of this material. And one of the things is maybe we've not even thought to even ask those questions as adult therapists working with the 20-year-olds. And it's because it's in the public domain right now, and we are now moving to a place of legislation through Data Protection, Online Safety Act, and, COPPA, COSA, Digital Services Act, all of the bits that are coming out. It's only because it's now on the agenda that we're aware of it. But for 27 years, there have been a cohort of adults who are now in our world whom this did happen to.
We need to create a society where our children can come to us and feel safe, because this technology, which could be causing them harm, is also, they rely on it. They rely on it to be social with their friends. So the threat of us taking that away from them could stop them from approaching us, from talking to us. So there's this real difficulty in because obviously as parents we want to just remove anything that's causing them harm, but actually that won't help.
Well, that's why the Jonathan Haidt piece around, we've become way too safe in the real world, like helicopter parenting. We're not exposed enough to natural environments, to levels of danger that help hone our how we show up in the world, but then way too unsafe, like you say, these hidden playgrounds. So parents are poorly equipped to understand how to bring an appropriate level of security and safety into that digital space without totally, removing the child from a tool for life, because it will be more than we've ever used.
So I'm aware that I want to say kind of and make 2 points that I don't necessarily agree with the Jonathan Haidt model because of the academics that I spend my time with in this particular area. But if we remove this technology, we are going to harm an enormous amount of children who rely on it, such as LGBTQ, children who are in domestic abuse situations, children who are young carers, children who are in resident, and it goes on and on and on. This isn't a blanket tool that we can use for everybody. But I will say one of my most viral social media posts was "Don't take your phone away from your children," which included when I was at the Belfast trauma conference, and I'm kind of stood there with my VR headset on, and this lady came over and she said, "Excuse me, are you the TikTok lady?" And I said, "Well, it depends on what you mean by TikTok lady." She said, "My daughter sent me a post." She said it might have been on Instagram, but she sent me a post telling me not to remove her phone because it was her playground, or it was the way. And I said, "Yes, I did do that video. Yes, that is me." And what she then ended up doing was taking a picture to send back to her daughter in New Zealand.
Amazing.
So I was in Belfast, and this was about a conversation. And I thought, this is the thing about the internet, isn't it? Is I was in Belfast. This was about somebody in New Zealand, and this was about the way that I'm educating online in terms of actually the dangers now are no different to what they were in 2010, 2011, and 2012. We are in a space at the moment where I think the finger of blame and shame has been directly pointed at parents, and parents are now frightened, shamed, angry, and they don't know what to do. And this is why the movement around let's ban them, let's delay. There are logical steps we could take, but certainly banning this technology is not the route to go down. And there are so many legislative difficulties with the approach that's being proposed by Jonathan Haidt that it is going to cause harm if we follow what he's suggesting at this point in time. And that's based on lots of conversations and even a recent podcast I did with a neuroscientist about this addiction narrative around what devices are and are not, what they provide, what they don't provide. It's complicated. It's complicated.
What you're doing is, as I said in the shoot, as a parent, it's a more empowering narrative than make them safe in this space that you think, well, how do I do that? Like, I know how intuitively and intrinsically to do that in the real life. And okay, I can take heed maybe that's, and I've got, there's too much safety. How do you sufficiently let go of the reins?
Yeah.
But how in a digital space? I didn't grow up like that. I've got no frame of reference for that. I think so. It's quite empowering as well. It's a bit like, I'm reminded of Ruth Cohn, who, talks about, she talks about parenting in a really empowering way to say, you can make bridges, you can make amends, what you can do to build trust and safety and security rather than what you've done to erode it. And so I also think that we need to get parents on side in order to create the change that we need to see. So those things like don't take your children's phone away is quite an empowering message from a parenting perspective. That is really missing from the space.
And some of that is around saying to parents, actually, you've got this. You can do this because you already know what it is that your child needs. And the most important piece of e-safety or online safety education advice I have for anybody is conversations, conversations, conversations. And that does not take place online. We begin with contingent moments in infancy, and we've lost some of those because parents are overwhelmed with advice on how they should or shouldn't raise their children. They're overwhelmed with whether they've done it correctly or not correctly, whether they put the right kind of shoes on, didn't put the right kind of shoes on, whether they're feeding them. It's overwhelming for all of us. And what I would say actually is if we're going to ban phones, maybe we should ban them for adults until their babies are 3, so that they can build those contingent moments, because that's the foundation of how we parent for children to go into an online safety space with us holding the reins and then allowing them to climb the climbing frame and take those risks.
That's exactly it. That's that point that you just made there was so perfect. If we're going to ban phones, ban it for parents up until the age of 3, because the most important thing, as you said, for e-safety is the relationship that the mother, father, or the carer has with the child. And that relationship, that attachment forms in those early years. And that's what's getting broken with the technology that we have today. And I think that's
So the principles that underlie this whole question around cyber trauma is exactly the same as everything. Secure attachment, good psychological, physically, it's the same. Brilliant. In your opinion, what would be the most profound thing we could do to affect the kind of change that we need to see?
Educate parents about babies. And I say that from a perspective of this is going to really show my age. When I was in school, quite often the sexes went and did different things, and the boys went and did their woodwork and metalwork, and the girls went and learned about babies. If we could understand brain development, neurobiology, what children really need in those first 1,001 days, we would parent differently as a society, and we would see children as the absolute gems that they are, rather than this pathology of it's the youth of today, it's the and finger pointing. And I think sometimes that's really my role as a child therapist, is helping parents understand this is about communication. This is really at the crux of all of the issues. So those, I think you referred to it earlier, building bridges. If those bridges were built early and secure and they were robust, we would have a very different society that understood empathy, compassion, connection, vulnerability, and being with other people.
I'd just like to build on that and say that the education is not for the individuals, but it's for the policymakers and for the way that we women, if you look in the US, you go back to work within 10 weeks after having had a child. That can explain a lot of the challenges that we see.
Mm-hmm. But I put the caveat on, and we do it without blaming the parents, because we do that so often, don't we? Say, well, blah, blah, blah. We're very good at that. I would never do that. But of course.
And if we just approach things with compassion and that education, then non-judgment, all the principles of being trauma-informed, then we get a difference. Kat, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm excited. I am quite a geek and excited to talk about this subject matter because it is so in-depth, and each of the so if I told you there's 67-ish different types of cyber traumas, that's 67 different separate training days. I can't write fast enough. I can't do as much as I want to.
You said earlier, it's also developing so quickly. So even though you are obviously extremely fast, I can see that your processing speed is way above a normal human being's processing speed to be able to write 7 books, to be able to have a conversation like we just had. However, like technology is advancing even faster than you obviously can, or any of us can probably. So at least you're there fighting the good fight, and trying.
Thank you. I was just like, wow, yes, actually, that's quite a feat, isn't it? I'm trying to go as fast as the technology. Who do I
You're trying, I can tell. You definitely fighting that you're trying. You're almost there.
Yeah, it was impressive. Really impressive.
Gosh. Thank you so much, Kath. It's been a real pleasure speaking to you. So thank you.